In the summer of 1894, Minnesota was dying of thirst. I want you to picture it. Not the abstract statistical version of a drought, not rainfall percentages and reservoir levels on a government chart. The actual physical reality of it. The rivers dropping week by week until the flat rocks on the bottom were visible in the afternoon sun. The wells running shallow, then running dry. The livestock standing at the edges of ponds that were shrinking visibly daily in a way that felt less like weather and more like something being taken away. The farmers worried about their crops. The fishermen worried about their boats running aground in channels that were no longer deep enough to float them. The logging crews watched the river levels and calculated how much longer they could move timber south before the water gave out entirely. Nobody was paying attention to the mud, not at first. But the water kept pulling back. Lakes that had been full for as long as any living person could remember began retreating inch by inch, week by week, exposing wide dark bands of lake bed that had never once seen sunlight in living memory. The exposed mud was black and dense and ancient smelling, the kind of smell that makes you aware, at some primitive level, that you are looking at something that has been sealed away for a very long time. And then in late July, along the western shoreline of Otter Tail Lake, the fishermen working the newly exposed shallows started finding bones. What they found in that mud, what they pulled out of that ancient black lake bed in the drought summer of 1894, was reported in newspapers, documented by local physicians, collected by institutional agents, and then systematically, methodically, almost completely erased from the historical record. This is the story of what they found. And the story of what happened to it afterward. Minnesota in 1894 was a young state in an old landscape. It had only achieved statehood in 1858, just 36 years before the drought. The European settlement of the northern lake country was even more recent. Most of the communities around the lakes of central and northern Minnesota had been established in the 1870s and 1880s, built around logging and fishing by people who had no generational memory of what the land had looked like before them. That matters enormously for what comes next, because what the drought exposed in those lake beds was something that predated the settlers by a very long time. Something that predated the most recent period of sustained habitation by any population the standard historical account is willing to acknowledge. To understand why, you need to understand the geology. Minnesota's Lake District is a product of glacial activity. The retreating ice sheet sculpted the terrain into the Bowland Ridge topography that produces thousands of lakes, and that retreat was not a smooth linear process. There were periods of dramatic redvance, catastrophic drainage reorganizations, and critically periods when water levels across the region were dramatically, fundamentally different from today. Lake Agassiz, the massive glacial lake that once covered much of Manitoba, Saskatchewan, North Dakota, Minnesota, and Ontario, was one of the largest bodies of fresh water in North American geological history. When it drained catastrophically and repeatedly, reorganizing the entire landscape. What this means is that the lake beds exposed by the 1894 drought had been underwater for varying periods, with some surfaces last exposed during earlier low-water episodes extending back thousands of years. If human habitation had occurred during one of those earlier low-water periods, and those sites had been subsequently submerged when water levels rose again, the skeletal and structural remains from those sites would have been preserved, sealed under the sediment. Protected by cold and darkness and the weight of the water above them, waiting, the drought of 1894 was severe enough to approach those earlier low-water marks. And when it did, the seal broke. The first reports came from the Otter Tail Lake region in late July of 1894. The lake, which sits in Otter Tail County in west-central Minnesota, had dropped dramatically over the preceding weeks. The western shoreline had receded far enough to expose a wide band of dark, compacted lake bed material that had apparently been underwater for generations. Fishermen working the shallows began noticing bones eroding out of the exposed banks where the retreating water met the newly uncovered substrate. Initially, the assumption was animal bones. Minnesota's lake country was rich with the remains of ancient fauna. Mastodon remains had been found in the state before. So had the bones of ancient bison, elk, and other megafauna from earlier periods. Finding large bones in a lowered lake bed was not on its face unusual. What made these finds different was their shape. The bones emerging from the western shoreline of Otter Tail Lake were not the bones of quadrupeds. They were the bones of something that had walked upright, a femur, a section of pelvis, ribs arranged in the unmistakable arc of a chest cavity, and a skull partially crushed by the weight of the sediment above it, but still clearly recognizable, with an orbital structure and cranial vault that said human to every person who laid eyes on it. The problem was the size. The femur, by the account of the men who found it and the local physician called out to examine the site, was substantially longer than any normal human femur. Contemporary accounts placed it at somewhere between 26 and 30 inches in length. A normal adult male femur runs roughly 17 to 19 inches. The bone they were looking at belonged to something that, if proportioned like a human being, would have stood somewhere between 7.5 and 9 feet tall. The local physician did not attempt to dismiss what he was seeing. He measured the bone. He noted its density, which he described as remarkable, far heavier than a modern femur of even half its length. He noted the joint surfaces, the rounded condyles at the knee end, the smooth ball at the hip end, all entirely consistent with a bipedal creature that had moved and loaded its skeleton exactly the way a human being does. He sent a written report to the State Geological Survey office in St. Paul. He did not hear back for 2 months. While the state apparatus was either deliberating or simply ignoring the report from Otter Tail County, similar finds were being made elsewhere across the drought-stricken lake country. In Crow Wing County, along the shores of Gull Lake, the retreating water had exposed a section of northeastern shoreline where erosion was cutting back into a low bluff. Workers hired to clear brush along the new shoreline edge encountered what they initially thought was a section of darkened, dense old timber. It was not timber. It was a section of human spine, vertebrae enormous, linked by the remnant fibers of cartilage that had partially mineralized over an indeterminate period of time. The foreman of the work crew stopped work immediately and had the site roped off. He sent a boy into town to fetch whoever could come and tell him what he was looking at. What came back was a local land agent, a minister, and eventually a correspondent from the Brainerd Dispatch, who published a brief item describing the vertebrae as belonging to a man of prodigious size, and noting that the site appeared to contain additional skeletal material extending back into the bluff. The article was published, it was read, and then the official response came, and the story stopped developing in public. The third and most significant discovery cluster came from the Leech Lake region in Cass County. Leech Lake, the third largest lake entirely within Minnesota, covering roughly 250 square miles, had dropped low enough to expose extensive sections of lake bed along the southern and eastern shores, areas that had apparently been underwater for a very long time. What the survey party found along the southern shore in August of 1894 was not simply bones. It was evidence of a habitation site. Post holes or their equivalent circular impressions in the compacted substrate indicating that vertical structural members had once stood in a regular pattern. Evidence of sustained fire use, charred material at a depth that placed it far below any layer that could be associated with recent or historical occupation. And skeletal material, again large, again unmistakably human in form, but outside the parameters of normal human scale. 3 partial skeletons at minimum. 1 skull described in enough detail to be informative, a pronounced brow ridge, a cranial capacity appearing larger than normal, teeth large, but otherwise human in appearance. These were not bodies disposed of in a lake. These were people who had lived on dry land that was subsequently inundated, people who had built structures, maintained fires, organized their habitation in patterns that spoke of settled, purposeful life. And they had been enormous. Here is where the story stops being merely strange and starts being something more deliberate. A representative from the Smithsonian Institution's Bureau of Ethnology passed through Brainerd in September of 1894. His stated purpose was to assess several recent discoveries in the region. He examined the Gull Lake material. He met with the work crew foreman. He arranged for certain specimens to be packaged and transporting east. After that, the local paper printed nothing further about the Gull Lake site. This pattern, discovery, local documentation, institutional arrival, removal, silence, is worth pausing on carefully because it repeats itself with enough consistency across enough sites to constitute a methodology rather than a coincidence. A discovery is made by local people with no academic agenda. Multiple credible witnesses corroborate the find. A local newspaper publishes a brief account. An institutional representative, almost always from the Smithsonian or a university-affiliated surveyor, appears and takes custody of the material. The local coverage stops. No published scientific paper follows. The specimens disappear into institutional storage, or more accurately, into the complete absence of any verifiable institutional record. This happened at Otter Tail Lake, at Gull Lake, at Leech Lake. It also happened in Ohio, in Illinois, in Wisconsin, in mound sites across the eastern half of the continent throughout the latter half of the 19th century. The Bureau of Ethnology, under the direction of John Wesley Powell, was actively engaged in the collection of skeletal remains from American archaeological sites during precisely this period. Powell himself was committed to a specific theoretical framework about North American prehistory, one that insisted there had been no advanced civilization on the continent prior to the cultures that European settlers encountered. Anything that threatened that framework was, at minimum, inconvenient. The Smithsonian's own records from the 1890s acknowledged the receipt of large numbers of skeletal specimens from the Midwest and Great Lakes region. What those records do not do with any consistency is account for where those specimens went. Researchers who have attempted to trace specific documented finds through institutional channels have repeatedly encountered the same outcome. The accession records are incomplete. The storage locations are unverifiable. The specimens, for all practical purposes, do not exist. The standard objection at this point is predictable and worth addressing directly. We should not, the argument goes, trust 19th century newspaper accounts and amateur reports. The people making these observations lacked the training to properly identify what they were seeing. Bones can be misleading. Perspectives on size can be distorted. The absence of peer-reviewed scientific confirmation is the real story, not any suppression of legitimate finds. These are reasonable objections in the abstract, but they collapse completely when applied to the specific Minnesota evidence. The objection assumes that qualified people examined the finds and determined them unremarkable, that the newspaper accounts were simply exaggerated descriptions of ordinary skeletal material. But that is not what the historical record shows. The historical record shows that institutionally affiliated people did come to examine the finds. They did take the material, and then they produced nothing. No paper saying the bones were misidentified. No paper saying the reported dimensions were exaggerated. No paper saying anything at all. Institutional silence is not the same as scientific debunking. And then there is the matter of the private correspondence. In the Mille Lacs region, not far from where the Drought finds occurred a decade later, excavations conducted in the late 1880s produced field supervisor letters now housed in a university archive. Those letters describe skeletal remains estimated at 7 to 8 feet in height, dense and well-formed, with pronounced skull ridge structures and larger than normal cranial volume. The field supervisor wrote candidly about his uncertainty regarding how to classify what he was seeing. His published report from those same excavations describes normal-sized remains entirely consistent with expected late woodland period populations. The private correspondence and the published report describe completely different things. Either the field supervisor systematically misrepresented his findings in publication, or someone between the field notes and the final published record made deliberate decisions about what the findings would officially be. Both possibilities are deeply troubling, and the pattern across multiple sites, multiple investigators, and multiple decades makes a single individual's error an increasingly untenable explanation. There is a dimension to the 1894 finds that conventional accounts almost never address seriously, and that omission is itself revealing. The Ojibwe people had lived in the Leech Lake region for centuries. Their oral traditions, carefully maintained, internally consistent, validated repeatedly when tested against physical and geological evidence, included references to a time when the water was different, the land was different, and the beings who inhabited the region before the Ojibwe were of a different character entirely. The traditions pointed toward prior habitation by beings of great physical stature who had left traces in the landscape. The early European settlers mostly dismissed these accounts as mythology, as primitive peoples' attempts to explain things they didn't understand, as colorful folklore that said nothing about actual history. And then the drought of 1894 exposed the lake beds, and what came out of the ancient mud was entirely consistent with what the Ojibwe traditions had been describing all along. That consistency is not coincidence, that is corroboration. Indigenous oral traditions are not mythology. They are carefully preserved repositories of historical and environmental knowledge, maintained across generations with extraordinary fidelity. Geologists have used similar traditions in other parts of the world to locate ancient earthquake sites, flood events, and volcanic activity. When an oral tradition aligns with physical evidence, that alignment demands serious attention. The institutional response that followed the 1894 finds had a specific effect on Ojibwe knowledge. By removing the physical evidence and producing no scientific account of it, the institutions left the oral traditions exactly where they had always been, in the category of folklore and legend rather than history and evidence. The people whose traditions were being confirmed did not benefit from the finds. They were not consulted about them. Their account of what the bones represented was not solicited or recorded. The Ojibwe knew something had lived in that lake country before them. The bones in the drought-exposed lake bed were, by their accounting, not surprising. They were confirmation of something already known. That the confirmation was then taken away and erased was simply another iteration of a dispossession that had been ongoing for decades. The question that skeptics most often use to deflect from the specific evidentiary problems is the motive question. What would be the reason for suppressing this information? Why would serious institutions go to the trouble of collecting and erasing evidence of large skeletal remains? What would be at stake? The answer requires understanding the political context of the late 19th century, the world in which John Wesley Powell was running the Bureau of Ethnology and shaping the official account of North American prehistory. The Smithsonian and the Bureau of Ethnology were deeply enmeshed in the politics of Native American dispossession. The official narrative of North American prehistory was not a neutral academic exercise. It was a tool of policy. The insistence that no advanced civilization had preceded the Native American cultures that European settlers encountered served a specific and immediate political purpose. It denied any prior claim to the land that might complicate the legal and moral frameworks being used to justify displacement and seizure. If the skeletal record showed a prior population of different physical character, a population whose civilization had collapsed or disappeared long before the cultures Europeans encountered, the dispossession argument became considerably more complicated. Much simpler to manage the record. Much simpler to have the anomalies collected, transporting east, and filed where they would not generate inconvenient questions in congressional hearings or treaty negotiations. This is not a conspiracy theory requiring secret societies or coordinated malevolence operating in the shadows. It is a bureaucratic response to inconvenient evidence, entirely consistent with how institutions have always handled material that threatens the frameworks on which their authority and funding depend. John Wesley Powell was not a cartoon villain. He was a man with a theoretical commitment and substantial institutional power, and he used one to protect the other. This happens in science. It has always happened. The Minnesota Lake Giants are one case among many in which it demonstrably did. The drought of 1894 ended the way droughts always end. The fall rains came. The following spring brought better snowpack. By 1895 and 1896, the lake levels had partially recovered. The exposed lake beds were resubmerged. The dark mud went back under the water. The sites along Otter Tail Lake, Gull Lake, and Leech Lake disappeared beneath the surface again. The material that had not been collected was once again sealed under the sediment and the weight of the water above it. But the newspaper accounts remained. They stayed in the local paper archives, ink on paper, distributed across too many locations for any institution to quietly collect and remove. They survived because no one thought to reach every copy, or because removing printed accounts from distributed archives is simply harder than collecting physical specimens from a remote lake bed. That is why we know what we know, not because the institutions preserved the record, because the institutions could not reach every piece of it. Children who were born in 1894 grew up hearing their parents and grandparents talk about the strange summer when the water went away and what was found in its absence. As those children aged and the living witnesses died and the stories moved further from direct memory and closer to the realm of local legend, the institutional silence began to do its work, without the physical specimens, without the published scientific account, without any official acknowledgement that the finds had been significant. The stories gradually lost their weight. By the mid-20th century, the 1894 drought was remembered primarily as an agricultural catastrophe. The skeletal finds had become less than footnotes. The lakes of central and northern Minnesota are beautiful. The water catches the light in the late afternoon, and the whole surface of Otter Tail Lake or Gull Lake or Leech Lake goes golden and still. And it is very easy, standing on that shore in that light, to not think about what is underneath, what was always underneath. What may be underneath still, sealed back into the dark and the cold and the weight of the water, waiting for the next drought severe enough to lower the surface again and expose the layer where something extraordinary once walked and built and died. The drought of 1894 was not the only window into that layer, but it was one of the widest windows that has ever opened, and it opened at precisely the moment when the institutional apparatus for closing windows like that was fully operational and well practiced. What we have left is what slipped through before the window closed. The newspaper accounts, the county land office reports, the field supervisor's private letters with their quietly devastating discrepancy from the published conclusions, the oral traditions of the Ojibwe, which were never collected and suppressed because they were never taken seriously enough to be considered a threat. And the pattern itself, the recurring shape of discovery, institutional appearance, removal, and silence, which is its own kind of evidence, even when the physical specimens are gone. The bones are not available for you to examine. The institutional records that might account for them are incomplete or inaccessible. The scientists who could have published findings chose not to, or were directed not to, or found that the findings they published needed to leave certain things out. What you are left with is the question. In the summer of 1894, the water went away, and something was found in the mud beneath it, something large, something human in form, something that predated by a very long time any population the standard historical account is willing to acknowledge. Credible witnesses documented it, institutional agents collected it, and then it disappeared into the same silence that has swallowed dozens of similar finds from across the continent over the past 2 centuries. That silence is not the absence of a story. That silence is the story. The lakes are full again now, have been for a long time. The mud is back under the water, under the fish and the boats and the quiet winters when the ice seals everything again. Whatever is down, there is still down there. Droughts come back, they always come back. And when the water drops low enough again, when the dark, ancient mud of the lake bed is exposed to daylight for the first time in over a century, the only question that will matter is whether we are ready to look at what comes out of it. Without immediately calling someone to come, and take it away.